I think 15 Leopard 2s have been hit, repaired, and are back on the front line. So looking at the fire, there might be a lot of fire damage inside the tank, but the running gear, the tracks looked okay. The hull looked intact, and the turret looked intact, and the gun looked intact. So, yeah, I wouldn't be at all surprised if a tank, whether it's that one or one very similar, comes roaring back along the front line.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by former British Army officer Hamish de Bretton Gordon. He's a former commander of the Royal Tank Regiment. Hamish has served on operations during the First Gulf War in Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's commanded main battle tanks for around 24 years. Hamish, welcome to Frontline. Thank you very much for your time today. Of course, we're talking to you today with your tank commander hat on. Let's start with that news this week that for the first time, a Challenger 2 tank donated by Britain has become the first of its kind to have been taken out by enemy fire. How surprised were you by that?
Well, not surprised when you think the amount of hard tank-on-tank fighting that is going on. We know that over 4,500 Russian tanks have been destroyed since the war started in February last year. So it's almost inevitable. The great thing is that we know that the crew survived. And the key thing about British tanks as against Russian tanks, we focus on firepower, mobility and protecting the crews. So that is it. The tank's done exactly what it needs to do. It's fought, it's protected the crew, and they've got out to fight another day.
Well, let's have a look at the footage then of the aftermath of this. This news was released by Russian troops earlier this week. Let's see the footage from inside a Ukrainian vehicle. So, Hamish, this was near Robotine, where Ukrainian troops have been breaking through Russia's lines of defence. No one was killed, as you say. What can this tell us about the state of the tank from looking at these pictures?
Well, at the moment, we understand that the tank initially went over a mine and the crew survived and got out. It was then subsequently attacked by a Russian drone, which is why we're seeing smoke bellowing out of it. Probably a fuel fire with that colour, and the extent of the damage we don't fully know. But the Challenge 2 is exceptionally well armoured, especially at the front and the sides, and the crew may not even know they've hit a mine, but they would have seen the damage and they would have got out. And I think the fact that the Russians are making such a play of this one tank really shows what a key bit of military capability it is on the battlefield. Along with the German Leopard 2 tanks, they are potentially tipping the balance. And the fact that we've seen them where they are at a critical point of the battle where we understand from the Ukrainians they're making significant progress, again, it leads us to believe that the Ukrainians are probably now keen and happy to commit some of their real top quality bits of kit, Challenger 2 and Leopard 2, to the fight.
So does this actually signify a renewed and heightened state of confidence then in Ukrainian forces and they're stepping up a gear?
I think it does. I think over the last 3 months of the counteroffensive, a lot of fighting has been going on a vast front, up to 1,000 kilometres wide. We know that the Ukrainian armoured forces have got to punch through a deep defensive position, trenches, barbed wire, minefields, some up to 20, 30 miles deep. We understand in this area and some other areas, actually now, Ukrainian forces have cleared those minefields, have punched through. They've created a bridgehead, which they're now expanding. So now that we've seen Challenger 2s in this area ready to attack, then that gives us confidence that they're making progress. The fact that the Russians have taken so much effort to take out these individual tanks, again, leads one to believe that the Russians, again, see it as key. So very sad that a tank's been lost, very happy that the crew has survived, and hopefully this is the beginning of a major development in the counteroffensive.
We're going to run some footage now of tanks in the UK. Of course, Challenger 2 was donated by the UK. These are tanks on parade, the Royal Tank Regiment parade in Bulford last September. Hamish, can you just tell us a little bit more about the Challenger 2, what its protection is, what its firepower is, and how that compares to Soviet-era tanks?
Yes, well, these are Challenger 2 tanks from my regiment, the Royal Tank Regiment. You can see the eyes on the side. These are Chinese eyes that have been on Royal Tank Regiment tanks since the First World War. The Malaysian proverb was, if you can't see, you can't fight. And when the Malaysians gave the Royal Tank Regiment some money to buy tanks, they insisted we had eyes on them. But the tank itself, about 69 tons, very well armoured with secret armour called Chobham armour and Dorchester armour. That's at the front that prevents it being taken out by Russian direct fire from tanks. It has a very powerful engine that can move it around the battlefield at 40 miles an hour. That doesn't sound very fast, but for a 69-ton vehicle, that's pretty impressive. And when it comes to firepower, the main armament is a 120 millimeter rifled gun, which can fire very accurately and take out another tank at up to 3 kilometers, which is much further than Russian tanks, and actually the Leopard tank as well. The main armament can also fire a high explosive shell, like an artillery shell, up to 17 kilometers, which is a big differentiator. Also on the tank, you have 2 heavy machine guns. One is coaxially mounted with the main gun, therefore it follows it, and the other is on the commander's station, and that's for air defense and also for protecting the tank to the left and the right. Along with that, we have what we call smoke grenade dischargers, and this fires off smoke to protect the tank so that it can move unseen. The other key bit of stealth that the Challenger 2 has is you can inject fuel into the exhaust pipes, and this creates a massive cloud of very dense smoke, again allowing the tank to get away. So you put all that together, the fuel will keep a tank going full on for about 24 hours, and it just uses common or garden sort of diesel or aviation fuel. So a very, very capable vehicle, crewed by 4 crew, a driver, a loader operator, the person who puts the ammunition in the gun, a gunner, and also the commander. And the commander is the person who is not only controlling the tank, he's on the radio speaking to his other tanks and to his higher command, and also making sure the tank gets to the right place at the right time. So a very skilled crew, very skilled job, working very closely together, sometimes shut down for 24 hours at a time. You really get to know your mates. When I first joined, my crew were all Glaswegians, and I was a young, fresh-faced boy out of public school. But those people are now some of my greatest friends. So it's a very incredible sort of life. But once you get used to it, and with something like a Challenger 2, it is a formidable fighting vehicle with a formidable fighting force.
Ukraine's Ministry of Defence released footage of a Ukrainian soldier who was extolling the capabilities of the Challenger 2. He called it a sniper among tanks. What do we know about how it's being used in a granular way in the counteroffensive on the ground?
Well, this is a really interesting piece coming out of the Ukrainian Defence headquarters, that the Challenger 2 can fire over such a long distance, accurately fire a tungsten dart, traveling at about 1,500 meters per second at over 3 kilometers. I think 3.5 kilometers is the record to take out a tank. Now, that is almost twice as far as a Russian tank or even a Leopard can fire. So it makes complete sense to use them in that sniper role, because they're out of range of the enemy, and very accurately, because of the rifled gun, it means that whatever goes down that barrel will go very accurately and very fast. Both the Russian tanks and the other Western tanks have what we call a smoothbore barrel, so that the shot, if you like, is not spinning to keep it accurate. So they're not quite so accurate. So it makes absolute sense. That's the advantage that you have. And to have 14 or now 13 of these tanks using that role seems to me to be a really effective way of doing it. And also, no doubt, what the Ukrainians are doing, there'll be a drone tethered, if you like, to that tank at the other end. So if it misses its target, the crew can see on the video from the drone where it's missed and adjust. And that is a new way of fighting that the Ukrainians have developed, not only with tanks, but also with artillery fire as well.
And do you think the Challenger 2s will be kept at that distance, that sniper distance, going forward?
Well, I think at the moment, because that seems to be the most effective way of using them. But once they break through the final lines of defense, what Ukraine will want to do is push as much armor through that gap as they can. Because once they're beyond that defensive position, there's very little else really to stop them in Crimea. We know that the Russian strategic reserve is already committed, and reports in the Daily Telegraph today saying that many have been killed in this area by Ukrainian forces. So I expect once the breach is secure, those tanks will push through using their mobility to get deep into Crimea and then hopefully rout the rest of the Russian forces.
I mean, that soldier I was talking about earlier, the Ukrainian soldier, he also made comparisons to the Soviet era tanks that they previously used. He said that the scariest thing about those tanks was the sound of the engine coming. Let's just talk a bit about the T72. What do you know about how many Ukraine has and how many Russia has?
Well, T72 is an old tank. And the T72 designate really means that these tanks were actually designed in the 60s and predominantly built in the 60s and 70s. So they are, up to 50, 60 years old, very numerous on both sides. And the majority of the 4,500 tanks the Russians have lost have been probably T72s. They are smaller than a Challenger 2, a much lower profile because Russian tanks only have 3 crew members. They have an auto loader, automatically loads the main armament with its projectile and the explosive to push it out the end. This means that the tank can be smaller and lower profile, but also means it carries a lot less ammunition. The other key element of the T72 is not very well armored protected. The Russians don't have quite the concern for their soldiers and tank crewmen as we do in the West and as the Ukrainians do. So they're prepared to trade off protection of that tank with mobility. And they believe by it being smaller, it's less easy to hit and acquire.
I've got some footage now that I can show you of T72s. The first in Kharkiv. Let's have a look at that. So, Hamish, this is a Russian tank. Can you tell us a bit more about what you can assess from the pictures?
Well, yeah, this T72, on the side there, it's got some sort of reactive armor and also on the turret. You see quite low profile, quite small. Key to that, there's no camouflage on it, which I find astounding. We've not seen any camouflage on any Russian tanks hitherto, but I do notice the Ukrainians are now camouflaging their tanks, and that is quite key and important. It's pretty mobile. It has that 125 millimeter smooth bore gun that we're looking at there, which is accurate out to about 2 kilometers, 2,000 meters, and also has some machine guns similar to the Leopard and the Challenger 2.
Yeah, we've got some footage of Ukrainians training on T72s. This is, I think, back in March. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how hard it is for the new troops coming in to get up to speed?
Well, absolutely. What we've seen, certainly studying the Russian use of tanks, because a lot of their expert tank crewmen were killed at the beginning of the war, they have a lot of very inexperienced tank crewmen and use their tanks in a very static and not using the mobility it has. Again, that is a challenge with training. And you can see here with the crews being trained to fire on the move, which is absolutely key because it means that you can hit targets and be less easy to be hit yourself. But it's the ability to move with your fellow tanks, not get too close, not stay static for too long. And ideally, when all the activity that we do in the UK and most NATO countries, we do it at night because that's where you have an advantage. But again, it takes an awful lot of training. And most of the tank action that we've seen in Ukraine so far has happened during the daylight, I expect, because the crews aren't trained and competent enough. But we now know that Ukrainians have been doing a lot of training over the last few months. And I expect they are more confident to now operate at night, and one would expect to see that that come to the fore in the future.
And how successful have the Ukrainians been in adapting the T72s for modern warfare?
Well, the T72, on the face of it, is a good tank. I mean, its main weakness is it's not very well protected, and one hit will generally destroy it. But if you can maneuver warfare where you are moving in conjunction with infantry and artillery and air power, you can make the most of it. And I think what we have seen evolving during this war is that the Ukrainians have got much better at maneuver warfare. I think they have definitely had a lot of advice, a lot of training from predominantly the UK actually, but other NATO troops as well. But it does take time, and I think they're also evolving to other methods. We've talked about drones. The way the Ukrainians use drones is something that we are all learning, and we will all use in future. But now these people, a lot of them have been fighting for months and blooded in action. Really hard, experienced soldiers, and we have seen them operating with this maneuverist approach against a Russian army that is very, very static, almost like the First World War. And that is why I think once they break through these front lines, which hopefully will not be too much longer, they will be able to use that experience that they've gained and that training they've had to really exploit it. Whereas the Russians seem to be unable to do much apart from sit in trenches and fight in a very sort of First World War type manner.
Russian tank losses are. There's no comparison compared to the Ukrainian tank losses. You said earlier some 4,500 tank losses on the Russian side of things. What explains that huge discrepancy?
I think we don't fully know the Ukrainian losses, but we are pretty confident that they are less than half of what the Russians have lost. The key thing with the Russians is because they have been very static. A tank is a maneuver piece of military hardware. It's best used when it's moving around the battlefield and covered by other fire. Now, all the Russians have used them as pillbox, as static, snipers, if you like, and they have been very easily acquired, very easily found by Ukrainian drones and other intelligence assets. And we've also seen that because they're uncamouflaged and they have little protection, Ukrainians have taken hundreds of them out simply by dropping hand grenades from drones through the hatches. And we've also seen how susceptible, particularly the T72s, T64s are. Once a fire starts in the tank, it generally sets off the ammunition and blows the tank to pieces. Whereas actually in a Challenger 2 and in Leopards, because the ammunition is protected in very secure armored charge bins, even if there is a fire inside, like we saw on the Challenger 2 yesterday, it doesn't actually blow up. So there are a lot of reasons that the Russians have lost so many tanks, and mainly it's the inexperienced crews, very poor leadership, and the Russians are just interested in mass and not too concerned about how many casualties they take, be it tanks or soldiers.
Of course, Ukraine is about to receive its the first of the US Abrams tanks, around 10 arriving, we understand, by mid-September. Let's have a look at them being used in training in the US now. So Hamish, 200 troops have been trained up to use them. How does this tank compare to the others supplied by the West?
The Abrams is a very, very capable tank, very similar in capabilities to both the Challenger 2 and the Leopard 2. Has a 120 millimeter smooth bore gun, 2 heavy machine guns, has very similar armor to the Challenger 2s, so well protected. It has a gas turbine engine, which is incredibly powerful and it's probably faster than the other tanks, but it uses up a huge amount of fuel. The key thing with the Abrams, over and above Leopard 2 and Challenger 2, is it's very, very simple to use. The Americans designed it so that their reservists and National Guards people could literally have a few days training on these tanks, get in and use them. And that's why I think they are going to be key to the battlefield in Ukraine, because you don't necessarily need hardened, seasoned tank soldiers. The actual mechanism of firing the gun is very, very simple. Driving it, you have a steering wheel rather than sticks. So they can be incorporated into the battle really very quickly. And we know that there are hundreds of Abrams tanks in tank sheds in Europe. And if the US see fit, they could push a hell of a lot more to the front line, and they would be incorporated much more quickly than, say, a Challenger 2 or a Leopard 2.
You mentioned the high fuel consumption. Is that likely to pose a logistical problem?
It's certainly with the Abrams, it certainly is something to consider. They use about twice the amount of fuel as a Challenger 2 or a Leopard 2. But having said that, because the logistics supply lines in Ukraine are so much easier for the Ukrainians, I expect, than the Russians, these tanks can just pull up at a local petrol station and fill up. So, and that's what they will be doing. So, yeah, it is a consideration, but it is not the issue that perhaps some of the Russian commentators and others are saying that it will be. And as long as there is fuel on tap, which there should be in Ukraine, then I think they'll provide the punch that Ukrainian forces absolutely need.
And in this first delivery, only 10 of 31 are likely to be arriving. How will Ukraine use them when they first get there, those 10?
Well, 10 tanks represents, in English parlance, a squadron of tanks. The Americans call them a company, but that is 10 is a comprehensive fighting force that the Ukrainians will recognize. And similar, the Ukrainians got 14 Challenger 2s. That's our squadron. The Americans have 10. That's just the way we do it. So I am sure, again, they will be used like the Challengers, put into key places where they can exploit their capabilities. And I expect, once they've been proven, hopefully the other 21 will follow very quickly. And if needed, hopefully the Americans can also supply many, many more, because, as I previously mentioned, there are a lot of Abrahams in sheds across Europe, predominantly in Germany.
So you think that those 10 will deploy to the front line almost immediately?
I would have thought. I cannot see any reason for holding them back, particularly if the crews have been trained, as we understand that they have been. And I think we are at a critical moment now of the counteroffensive. So if they need an extra punch, then these Abrahams will do it. And I think psychologically as well for the Ukrainians. Obviously, the Challenger 2 is a key marked bit of kit, and the Ukrainians love it, as we've heard. And we know the Russians hate it. I mean, the amount of vitriol on the social media at the moment about Challenger 2 is phenomenal. So if I was the Ukrainian commander, I would be pushing home that psychological advantage, getting the Challengers in there, getting the Abrams in there, and of course not forgetting the Leopard 2s, which have done a great job as well.
You point out it's a critical time. Winter is approaching. The Institute for the Study of War is saying that Ukraine has now breached the first two lines of defence on some parts of the front line. How does Ukraine push forward and hold any gains with the winter approaching?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that winter is a concern. The view is maybe we've got 4 to 6, maybe 8 weeks of good terrain left, and we're really talking about tank manoeuvre, being able to do that before the mud makes it very, very difficult. As has been described, there are areas where the remains of the Russian defence are very thin, and only today on social media there's a lot of panic coming from Russian bloggers who are screaming for reserves to be sent to various areas of the front line. So what one appears maybe we are at a tipping point. I think once they break through, because they have this ability to manoeuvre, I and other experts expect the Russians with morale is absolutely at the bottom at the moment. All the very good commanders that the Russians had, Alibite, pretty evil people, have now disappeared. So I would expect morale to crumble, and I think Ukraine has the forces to be able to hold that ground. And of course, they have the moral component as well. They are fighting for their own territory. A lot of these Russians, I think the first chance they get out of there, they'll take it.
And just to return where we started, is that hit on the Challenger 2, is it anything more than just a moment in history and a first?
I think it is absolutely that. I think it's hugely significant. Psychologically, it's been very damaging, apparently, to the Russian forces and morale. This is just one tank amongst many, many thousands. And the fact that the crew have survived from a mine strike and an attack by some suicide drone, I think will give everybody a lot of heart. And I'm sure it'll give people a lot of heart back in this country that actually a lot of criticism that Challenge 2 has had in the past. It's something that I've spent many thousands of hours on. It's a great piece of kit. Will be good news. So I think it is a moment in time, but hopefully it's also a critical moment because it will allow hopefully the Ukrainian forces to push on, break through that last line of defense, and start routing the Russians, who we know, apart from their leaders, sat comfortably in Moscow and not really up for this fight.
I'm half wondering, Hamish, that the next video that might be released by the Ukrainian Defence Ministry might be that Challenger 2 being back on the road, having been repaired.
Well, absolutely. We don't know the full damage of it, but we know that I think 15 Leopard 2s have been hit, repaired, and are back on the front line. So looking at the fire, there might be a lot of fire damage inside the tank, but the running gear, the tracks looked okay. The hull looked intact, and the turret looked intact, and the gun looked intact. So, yeah, I wouldn't be at all surprised if a tank, whether it's that one or one very similar, comes roaring back along the front line.
And when you put your experience of tank warfare into context, how has what's happening today in Ukraine compare with that?
Well, I think tank warfare fundamentally has not changed since the First World War. It's all about using the tanks for shock action, at the right time where they can have an impact, using their firepower, their mobility, and their protection for best advantage, but supported by the other elements of the battlefields. So tank warfare hasn't changed. There have been some different nuances. The use of drones to spot for tanks and artillery is something I'm sure, back in the Ministry of Defence here in the UK and the training areas, everybody's looking at, see how we can utilise these very cheap, very capable drones. So, yeah, fundamentally, the way you use them hasn't changed. The way you use them if you want to be successful hasn't changed. And I think a lot of people have written off tanks. And I wrote a piece in the Telegraph this week suggesting that might be premature. I think the tank will still have a place on the battlefield, for some time to come because of its key qualities of firepower, protection, and mobility.
Hamish de Bretton Gordon, thank you so much. It's been great speaking to you. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to today's producer, Morgan Burdick, and to you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. But for now, though, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.